Hello everybody. Today we're going to take an introductory look at lights and cameras in Maya. So first of all, if we're going to look at lights, we need something to light up. So I'm going to create a sphere and a cube. You'll remember that in an earlier video we went over creating your first render in Maya. I'm going to open up Maya's render settings, and I'm going to change my render from Arnold Render to Maya Software. Changing over to Maya Software as my render, I will close the render settings and I will click on the Render the Current Frame button to create a render of my scene. Currently, Maya is just using a default light. So that we can compare this render to later renders, I am going to click on the Keep Image button, which can be found here. As an introductory to lights, we're going to keep it simple and just look at two different kinds of lights, a spotlight and an ambient light. To create a light, what I can do is go to Create, Lights, and I'm going to create a spotlight. Using my Move tool, I will move the light back on the Z-axis. And if I open up my outliner, you'll see that the light shows up there as well. Another way that I can create a light is by going to my shelf. Under the Rendering tab, you'll see that there are a number of different light selections. I'm going to create another spotlight. I actually don't need two spotlights, however, so I'm going to delete it. Remember that pressing 4 on your keyboard will put your viewport in wireframe mode. 5 will be shaded mode. 6 is textured, although we don't have any textures applied. And 7 will be lights. In addition, I can also change it to these different viewing modes by going to the title bar of my viewport where there are some icons. To work with lights effectively in Maya in your viewports, it is naturally important that you look at it in light mode. To move the light and position it, you use the same move and rotate tools that you use with the polygon primitives. But this is in fact not the best way to place a light. There's a much more intuitive and effective way to place your lights. With my light selected, I'm going to go to my top viewport, and under Panels, I'm going to select Look Through Selected. Now my upper left viewport is looking through the light as if it were a camera. I'm going to quickly reset the light's rotations to 0. And now, in my upper right viewport, I can treat the light just as if it were a camera. This is a much more intuitive means for placing your lights. Notice as I reposition the light, in my perspective viewport, you can see the effect it is having on the two polygon primitives. Returning to my perspective viewport, we'll take a look at what effect the light is having on these objects. And with my light still selected, we'll take a look at it in the attribute editor. In the attribute editor, I can change some of the properties of my light. For instance, I can change the color of the light. And I can also change the intensity. I'm going to do another render so that we can compare it to my first one. Here's my new render, which I will keep, and here's the original render. At this point, there's really not a big difference between the two. Objects can be shaded and they can also cast shadows. But if I want to cast a shadow, I'm going to need to create a surface. So I'm going to create a polygon plane. I'll select the sphere and cube and raise them up above this ground plane. And you'll notice that it currently is not casting a shadow. I'm going to create another render, and in my render you will also see that there are no shadows being cast. To turn on shadows in my perspective viewport, I will go to Lighting, Shadows. And now that I've enabled shadows in my perspective viewport, I can position the light much more effectively to create the effect that I want. Now that I have the shadows like I want, let's create another render. Notice that we in fact still do not have shadows in our render. The shadows that we enabled are simply for our working view, not for the actual render. To actually turn on the shadows, I need to select the light, go to the attribute editor, and find shadows. Here I will check Use Depth Map Shadows. And now, when I render, I have my shadows. And we can toggle between my previous render and the new one to compare them. Now that we have shadows enabled, let's take a look at a few more properties of our spotlight. Cone angle does not move the light, but enlarges or decreases the cone of the light. While the penumbra angle will soften the outline of the light. And if we do another render, we can compare with the spotlight with and without the adjustment to the penumbra angle. The shadows and shading are very dark. More advanced rendering solutions, such as Arnold, will take into account bounced light. But with the Maya software render, we have to fake this. I'm going to create a second type of light, an ambient light. I can create the ambient light by going to Create Lights Ambient Light, or I can create the ambient light from the shelf. By making the ambient light's intensity a very low number, I can tone down some of the shading and shadows. I'll create another render and then compare it to my previous one to see the effect that the ambient light is having. We'll now move on to some properties of cameras. I'm going to go back to my render settings. Notice that in the render settings I can change my image size. This refers to my renders. For instance, if I change my image size to 320 by 240 and then render it, the image will be much smaller. And if I want a much larger image, I can change the image size to the preset HD 1080. Rendering it will give me a considerably larger image. Notice that the larger image takes slightly longer to render. If I click on the 1:1 button, it'll show me the true resolution on my monitor. Not only can we use the image size presets, we can also put in our own custom dimensions for our image renders. I'm going to try 512 by 512. Notice that my render now is a square image that is 512 pixels wide and 512 pixels tall. I'm going to set the image size back to the preset HD 540. As artists, it's very important that we know where the borders of our composition are. By clicking on the Resolution Gate button, I can now see the actual borders of my composition. Notice that if I go back to my render settings and put it at 512 by 512, the resolution gate changes in my viewport to show where the new borders of my composition are. Notice that if I frame these two objects so that their edges come right to the borders of the composition, if I render it, the render looks the same. I really can't stress enough how important it is for us as artists to be able to compose our scenes the way that we intend. This is why it's so important to know exactly where the borders of your render are. Remember that I enabled the resolution gate in the viewport itself. I want you to be aware, however, that you can also do this in the attribute editor. By selecting the camera and going to the attribute editor under display options, you can enable or disable the display resolution here as well. With the camera still selected and in the attribute editor, let's take a look at another property. I'm going to look for environment. Clicking on the background color swatch will open up a color wheel. Here I can change the color of my background. Notice that I've now changed my background from black to this muted blue color. I'm going to step away from the camera properties for a moment because I want to show you a special kind of material. I'm going to open up my hypershade, and I'm not going to create a Lambert or a Blinn or a Phong as we've done in the past. This time I'm going to create a material called Use Background. Now let's see what happens when I apply this Use Background material to my ground plane. Notice that the ground plane disappears, however, it still accepts shadows. We'll see the same effect if we render it. We don't see the ground plane, however, it accepts shadows. Shadows can really help ground an object, make it feel like it's actually sitting on the surface. Currently, my sphere is floating a little bit above the ground plane. I'm going to go to my side viewport and place it exactly on the ground plane. I'll do the same with the cube. Now that I've situated my two polygon primitives, I'll render it, and it looks much more like they're actually laying on a surface. I'm going to select my perspective camera again and return to the environment section in the attribute editor. You can do more than just change the background color. We can also apply an image. To do that, I will go to the image plane and click on Create. Finding the image name field, I'll click on the folder to the right, and I will navigate to where I have an image. I'm going to select an image of the beach. Notice that it is now using this photograph as my background. And if I render it, you'll see that it is using this background image here as well. The image, however, doesn't fit well to the resolution of my image. So I will go to Placement, and I will look at some of the options for fitting it. In this case, I'm going to select horizontal. I'm going to make a few quick adjustments to the placement and scale of my two objects. I'm going to make the sphere look like it's sitting on the surface and the cube as if it were floating. And I'll do another render. My render looks a little washed out. However, I can adjust the exposure or the gamma to address this. And I think I like this better. Now, if I want to save my image, I will go to File, Save Image. Remember that you want to check Color Managed Image. Also remember to change the file type to the type of image format you want to render. Give your render a name, and make sure you know where you're saving the image to. You may sometimes find that your shadows look a little bit pixelated. To address this, I'm going to select my spotlight and go to the Attribute Editor. Under Shadows Depth Map Shadow Attributes, I can change the resolution of the shadow. I'm going to change it from 512 to 1024. And this will give the shadows greater resolution. Adjusting the filter size will soften the shadows a bit. I'm going to change mine from 1 to 3. We'll quickly review the steps of working with the lights and cameras, returning to the snowman that you've seen from earlier videos. Remember to change your render from the Arnold render to Maya software, and set the size that you want your image to be. The spotlight really is the easiest light to work with. I'm going to create a spotlight. Remember in your viewport that 4 will be wireframe, 5 shaded, 6 textured, and 7 lights. And don't forget that the easiest way to position your lights is to look through it as if it were a camera. You'll need a surface to cast shadows on. I'm going to create a plane. I can enable shadows in my viewport by going to Lighting Shadows. Ambient light is the second light we looked at today. It is used to fake bounced light in your environment. Generally, you'll want to work with very low values of intensity with this light. Remember that if you do a render, you actually won't have shadows unless you tell your light to use depth map shadows. Enabling the depth map shadows will create your shadows in your renders. To know where the actual borders are of your composition, remember to enable resolution gate. Selecting my camera, I can go to the attribute editor, and under environment I can change the background color. Or I can apply an image as my background. You may need to fit the background image to your image size. And don't forget that you can use a special material called Use Background. This material is transparent, however it does accept shadows. In the render view, you can make some adjustments to the exposure and gamma. And when you're satisfied with the image, you can go to File, Save Image. Don't forget to check Color Managed Image. Set your file type, give your image a name, and make sure that you know where you're saving it to. So this has been a quick introduction to lights and cameras. In later videos, I'll be going in more depth on these subjects, but this should be enough to get you started. As always, thanks for watching and see you next time.